Good afternoon, everyone. So many prompt attendees today. We'll go ahead and get started in about 2 or 3 minutes, but thanks for hopping on. Hi, everyone. We'll get started here in about 2 minutes. Thanks for jumping in and welcome. All righty. Looks like people have kind of stopped trickling in, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Bell, the Channel and Field Marketing Manager for the West here at Critical Start. Before we get started, I'm going to review just a couple quick housekeeping items. You all should be on mute. If for some reason you're not, please go ahead and put yourself on mute now just to reduce background noise during the presentation portion of this event. We will have time saved at the end for Q&A. So please submit your questions through the chat or through the Q&A functionality of Zoom. I'll be monitoring that and make sure Matthew, our speaker, addresses those at the end of his presentation. This Lunch and Learn is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email after the session, including the recording of this webinar. You will also be receiving an email from Uber Eats with your $25 voucher by the end of day today. Those will be sent out after the recording. So you should not have a voucher in your inbox right now, but you will get one by the end of day today. That $25 voucher is good for a week, so it will be good through Thursday, December 22nd. Now let's go ahead and get to the good stuff here. I'm going to hand it over to Matthew Herring, our Director of Cyber Threat Intelligence and Detection Engineering, to kick us off. Thanks, Matthew.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. Let's kick off. And so for today's agenda, we've got a couple of topics to follow. So we're going to start with our observations and then move right into some of the key events that we saw this year. We're then going to cap it all off with what we expect to see next year and then why it all matters. And so it was quite a year this year, lots of attacker activity, lots going on in the ransomware ecosystem, some major 0 days that dropped, so plenty of ground to cover. So let's get started. And so what did we report on? And so every week, Critical Start releases our cyber threat intelligence summary, which is a collection of the most significant events over that week that we've observed. In addition, we also send out advisories, situation updates to our customers for critical events or any fluid situations that may be emerging or in progress. And so with that, what we've observed, let's take a look at some of the major trends. And so this year, Cobalt Strike really took center stage. while it wasn't the story, it was a part of many of our stories because it's one of the most prolific tools in the adversary's arsenals. It was originally developed as a legitimate penetration testing tool. And because of that, it's popular with attackers because it's so powerful. It's easy to deploy, it's extremely versatile, and it provides a high level of functionality for persistence, lateral movement, command and control. Another thing to note is Emotet. Um, in this case, it appears to have been used widely early this year by the Conti affiliates to gain initial access in order to deploy Conti's ransomware. And we are continuing to see that relationship between those two actors really ramp up over the last couple of months. We should also note here that Lockbit, according to Recorded Future, was reported as the most active ransomware group as of November of this year, with nearly 1,100 victims posted to their extortion site. So throughout the year, we identified and reported on multiple intrusions or observed activity associated with this particular malware. And so pivoting away from the tools, let's talk about who's actually using them. The Conti ransomware group this year was by and large the most active group, both in their rise, but also in their ultimate demise and rebranding. Personally, this story that surrounds Conti with their affiliations and how they really kind of fell out of disfavor and then rebranded into multiple groups, personally, I find very interesting. We'll cover the saga on the Conti group and then the post-Conti groups and rebranding later on in this presentation. We're also going to look into Lapsus, who burst onto the scene, made a lot of noise earlier this year, and caused quite a bit of commotion with some very large victims. And so now with Black Hat and Alpha, this is something that really caught our eye. And so we dug in a little bit this year. Black Hat was really a trendsetter in that they were the first group to move to a Rust-based malware. And so later on in this presentation, we're also going to discuss why this is important. And so, as has been the trend with past conflicts, cyber attacks tend to coincide with the boots on the ground. And so let's talk a little bit more about what we've observed as the situation between Russia and Ukraine escalated into armed conflict. And so as troops lined up across the Russia-Ukraine border in January of this year, the world geared up for a conflict that even to this day continues to endure. Not long after the hostilities kicked off into actual action by Russia, we at Critical Start did a deep dive on the activity as we saw the situation escalate, both on the battlegrounds, but also in cyberspace, where Ukrainian government websites were defaced and new malware such as Hermetic Wiper, Isaac Wiper, Caddy Wiper appeared to target the Ukrainian government. And so since our initial webinar back in February, which I highly recommend you check out if you hadn't had a chance to, talking about the history and the conflict, we've since seen some new activity. So let's take a look at that. And so March 22nd of this year, the Ukrainian CERT publishes an alert describing an intrusion by an actor that they describe as UA0026. Critical Start, our CTI team, then follows up with our customers and our weekly intelligence summary on the 4th of April. Analysis by Sentinel Labs observes linkages between the design of the malware samples, the associated loaders, and then past infrastructure with a Chinese-speaking threat group who they previously reported as Scarab, which was first observed active in 2012 and then was actually reported several years later in 2015. In this intrusion, the malicious payload was delivered in an archive file titled on the preservation of video recordings of criminal actions of the Army of the Russian Federation. And so, again, using the conflict as fishing bait. While this specific motivation for this attack is really yet to be understood. Scarab has been known in the past to target their victims for the purpose of geopolitical intelligence collection. Now, what's very interesting, according to Sentinel Labs, is that this is actually the first publicly reported attack on Ukraine from a non-Russian APT group since the invasion. So again, not long after the invasion, some individuals, as a couple of different collectives, also start to get involved and threaten action against Russian interests or companies operating in Russia. And so a few, Halliburton, Schlumberger, Citrix, and most recently Bridgestone, actually respond publicly to the anonymous threats about organizations operating in Russia, and publicly suspend their operations in that country as a result of those threats. We also observe a collective who refer to themselves as the IT Army of Ukraine, who also coalesce around this mission to disrupt Russian operations. And so, keeping with standard procedures for these individuals acting as part of a larger collective, such as Anonymous, the focus here was really on disruption and defacement, whereas the Ukrainian IT army encourages their cohorts to really focus on DDoS attacks. We see a lot of anonymous actors, so people using anonymous tags on like Twitter, taking credit for knocking websites down with DOS, as well as defacing websites. And so, as in previous conflicts between the two nations, critical infrastructure in Ukraine again became a target with the appearance or potentially reappearance of the Industria malware, in this case, Industria 2, and the Sandworm group, who's reported to be a group attributed to Russia's GRU, which is essentially their main intelligence directorate. The first observed stage of this malware was, or the first observed usage of this malware was December 17th back in 2016, as Russia and Ukraine traded shots in cyberspace following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Analysis of this newer iteration of the Industria malware shows that the adversary had actually maintained access in the target networks and really did have a very solid understanding of that environment. And so, fast forward to August of this year, at the Black Hat Conference, ESET researchers Robert Lipovsky and Anton Cherepanov presented their research on this intrusion attempt. They were joined by an individual named Viktor Zhura, who is the Deputy Director of Ukraine's State Service of Capital Communications and Information Protection, who then detail out Ukraine's response to this intrusion. This particular intrusion and the attempt on the Ukrainian power grid is actually a narrow miss this time. And so Ukrainian officials were notified very quickly about the attempt, and they were able to take swift action. There is a thought that there was a little bit of luck that actually contributed to the avoidance of a catastrophe in Ukraine, as the time of the payload was expected to run, which was estimated to be about late Friday afternoon in Ukraine, was actually at a time when many of the Ukrainian workers had left for the week. And so, according to Mandiant, this attack is significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, operational technology attacks are rare. It's not often we see APT groups or individual actors targeting things like the power grid or other kinds of industrial technology. This is also the first instance in which code from a broadly known operational technology malware was redeployed against a new victim. A little bit of a shakeup in the ransomware market. So let's shift focus a little bit and talk about just how big of a year this year was in ransomware. We're going to go ahead and examine one of the most impactful groups this year and what it's meant for the ransomware threats. And so this year, Conti was by far one of the most prolific and damaging ransomware groups, with nearly 900 leaks posted to their leak site, according to research done by Recorded Future. in February, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Conti Group publicly announces their support for Russian interests, for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then openly threatened to target those who may support Ukraine or Ukrainian interests, both on the cyber and the physical fronts. And so following this public statement, and then a quick adjustment to soften the narrative, we begin to start seeing the disillusion and rebranding of this group. How are the two related, though? So first off, because of their affiliation with Russia, many victims are actually not able to pay as to avoid violation of sanction laws, because they publicly disclose and are broadly known to be a Russian affiliated ransomware actor. Most victims at this point aren't able to pay. Additionally, late February timeframe, we see a new user on Twitter who calls themselves Conti Leaks, and they share over 17,000 historical chat records, which highlight many of the inner workings of the Conti Group, as well as the source code for the encryptor. The chats highlight the organizational structure, how they recruit and manage their malware developers, and really highlight how the Conti organization really treats themselves like an enterprise organization. So getting back to the disillusion and rebranding of the group. So May 19th of this year, researchers from Advanced Intelligence report that the Conti infrastructure had actually been taken down. And so following this dissolution, removal of the infrastructure, and the splitting up of the group, we do see a splintering into a number of autonomous and semi-autonomous groups. So Karakurt, Blackbyte, Black Basta, they become a singular entity focused on data exfiltration. And then we see groups like Silent Ransom, Roy Xeon, and Quantum focusing more on the ransomware operations side, all heavily utilizing a technique which we refer to as bizarre call. So let's real quick dive into that. And so initially observed in 2021, we see a major resurgence in the utilization of this particular tactic by many of the most prolific players in the ransomware market: Silent Ransom, Roy Xeon, Quantum. This tactic is so effective because it's tailor-made for the intended target. It allows adversaries to more readily bypass traditional defenses because of the lack of attachments or other indicators that may show that it's a malicious or fraudulent email, and really enables these attackers to increase the rate of success. And so how does this work? And so the users, the intended victim, will receive an email from the organization pretending to be a paid subscription service. Hey, thank you for joining this. It's time for your renewal. If you have any questions, call our contact center. Well, most of these individuals don't have a Duolingo or a masterclass or one of the other subscription services that these actors are pretending to be. And so they're going to call in and go, hey, what's going on? Why am I getting these emails? In which case, at that point, the adversary on the opposite end of the phone in that call center is going to really convince them to download and execute malicious software, malicious Office documents, things like that. So remote management tools that may otherwise be known good will be used for malicious purposes, macro-enabled Office documents for initial access. And once that call center operator has that individual hooked, has them where they've executed the software and have given that individual remote access to the host, a penetration tester goes in, starts gaining a foothold, establishing persistence, moving laterally, while the call center operator continues to distract that victim, talking them through the process of renewal or cancellation. So Conti wasn't the only group this year that captured the attention of the security community. A group known as Lapsus doubled down on their initial attack late last year and caused quite a commotion. So let's discuss. So early this year, Lapsus caught many by surprise as they targeted and succeeded to infiltrate some of the world's biggest companies. What made investigating them so difficult is that they rarely followed a specific playbook, as we tend to see with more mature or more consistent operators, nation state groups, things like that. Claire Tills, who's a senior research engineer at Tenable, describes the methods that they used as bold, illogical, and poorly thought out. And so, yes, this group was disorganized. They were very vocal. They were extremely chaotic, but they were also very effective. And so, according to reports from Microsoft and NCC Group, Lapsus leverages several techniques, including initial access via purchased or publicly available credential repositories, using password stealers, or sometimes even paying employees for access, as we see in this public Telegram post up on our screen. They would circumvent MFA through spamming prompts or contacting a help desk. And so Uber actually got hit through what we refer to as an MFA bomb, where the actor will just hammer the push notifications for some of the multi-factor authentication where you approve the login attempt. Eventually, the victim would get so tired of hitting no that they would hit yes, either to make the alerts go away or inadvertently hit yes. And that was one of the ways that Lapsus would use to gain access. They'd access internet-facing applications like virtual private networks, SharePoint, virtual desktops, in order to collect credentials and access other sensitive information. They would elevate privilege by exploitation of unpatched vulnerabilities in Jira, GitLab, and Confluence, as well as enumerating users with Active Directory Explorer. We'd see them exfiltrating data via NordVPN or using free file drop resources and then actually deleting the files in the targeted organization. Another thing they would do is using access to the target's cloud environments to build up their attack infrastructure, then removing all other global administrators. So let's take a real quick look at the timeline of some of the key events associated with this group throughout the year leading up to the arrests later on. And so beginning of this year, Brazilian Ministry of Health is still reeling from an attack that targeted some of their vaccination data. January, Okta is hit with lapses targeting remote desktop on a third-party customer support service, one of their laptops, so third-party attack. Really highlighting again that third-party risk that a lot of companies do need to be aware of. And according to Okta, while Lapsus was unable to perform any configuration changes, any password or MFA resets, or do any kind of customer support impersonation events, they do report that approximately 2.5% of the customers were impacted in this incident. Fast forward to February, we see some drama emerge between NVIDIA and Lapsus. Following the attack on NVIDIA, Lapsus publicly claims that this hardware giant hits them back and reclaims their data after targeting Lapsus's servers with ransomware. This is never confirmed by NVIDIA. Again, in March, we see a number of organizations, very large organizations, including Samsung, T-Mobile, and even Microsoft, get hit by Lapsus. Not long after, in a turn of fate for the group, 7 teenagers are arrested in London associated with these attacks, 2 of whom are actually charged for the crimes. And then September, we start to see more disclosures of attacks, this time with Rockstar Games and Uber. And while Uber didn't report any data exfiltration, the group did gain access to their internal Slack channels and their open DNS services, which did allow them to redirect their employees to graphic images and to post graphic images into the company's Slack channels. They were also alleged to have leaked videos of the development of and the source code for the upcoming release of Grand Theft Auto 5. And so late last year, early in this year, as security professionals worked off the holiday hangover from a very massive response to the Log4Shell vulnerability, we were treated with some additional 0 days that continue to make this year one to remember. So we're going to cover 3 today, all of which were very extensively leveraged by threat actors. So our first vulnerability today, CVE 2022-30190, which allowed remote code execution via a maliciously crafted document using the Microsoft Diagnostic Support tool. At first glance, it's presented as bad, but not that bad. And then you factor in the ubiquity in Microsoft Office products, and that the vulnerability was actively being exploited in the wild, it becomes a bigger problem much more quickly. And so 27th of May, 2022, a researcher from NAOSAC shares an interesting malicious document where they identify usage of the Microsoft Diagnostic Support tool to execute PowerShell scripts. And then further analysis by security researcher Kevin Beaumont confirms that this observed document actually exploits a 0-day vulnerability in MDST. 3 days later, 30 May 2022, Microsoft confirms and then publishes guidance on this vulnerability, including mitigation steps and path to patching. And so not long after, additional usage of this vulnerability is observed out in the wild. So May 30th, same day that Microsoft confirms, publishes guidance, recorded future incident groups identifies a spear phishing attempt targeting an individual associated with the Tibetan government who's in exile. A month later, June 30th, a weaponized document discovered that uses the nuclear threat of an attack against Ukraine as a lure. This document is thought to be attributed to a group APT28, also known as Fancy Bear, again, another group out of Russia's General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate, their GRU, who's known to actively target organizations for political espionage purposes. So another vulnerability, not long after Felina, again, caused quite a buzz. It was network exploitable, easily leveraged, and allowed for remote code execution. So really a triple threat from a security standpoint. Add in active exploitation, and it becomes a very urgent situation very quickly. And so on the 31st of May of this year, a cybersecurity firm, Velexity, notifies Atlassian of an observed remote code execution on Confluent server following an investigation that they did for one of their clients. They observe a web shell written into a publicly accessible web directory identified as a JSP variant on the China Chopper web shell. A couple days later, on the 2nd of June, Atlassian releases a security advisory informing customers of this critical remote code execution vulnerability. Also noting that it is under active exploitation. And so immediately following public disclosure of this vulnerability, Akamai researchers observed nearly a peak of nearly 100,000 exploit attempts per day, averaging down to about 20,000 daily attempts. According to Atlassian, this vulnerability allows unauthenticated users to execute arbitrary code on a Confluent server data center instance. So the advisory informs users to either patch or implement the documented workarounds in the event that the companies or the individuals can't patch those servers. June 3rd of this year, CISA, an organization under the FBI for infrastructure, advises all other federal agencies to block internet traffic to and from Confluent servers, and then to either patch or discontinue use. And so on that same day, Steve Adair from the firm Velexity provides additional analysis stating that multiple threat actors had actively been using this vulnerability, as well as ways to investigate or review for any potential activity or utilization of this vulnerability. So moving forward, August of this year, Vietnamese firm GTSC identifies and reports a 0-day discovered during an investigation and identifies wider patterns in exploitation. So working with the 0-day initiative, these researchers go ahead and notify Microsoft of their finding. Microsoft then confirms and releases the CVE in September. However, patches at this point are actually still in progress. 7th of October, Microsoft publishes mitigation guidance while they prepared the patch. And then finally, on November 8th, Microsoft releases patches for Exchange covering this vulnerability. The review of the code in the web shell that actually spawned from the initial exploits observed, and then the user agent used to install these web shells points to activity, again, associated with Chinese actors. These actors are observed using these chain 0 days to deploy the China Chopper web shell for persistence, data theft, and to move laterally through their victims' networks. So even recently, even as recent as just the 5th of this month, we're still seeing continued evidence of exploitation in this vulnerability, even as Rackspace recently discloses a security incident involving exploitation of a managed Exchange server using this particular chain vulnerability. So let's do a real quick recap of our reporting with some of the context of the events we just covered. So again, Cobalt Strike continues to be an issue. And while we do see some actors refactoring, looking to modify playbooks, change their approach, use different languages, Cobalt Strike is and will continue to be a clear and present danger to organizations. Also, ransomware and droppers such as Iced ID, Emotet, and Qbot will continue to be a persistent problem. This year, ransomware really took the center stage, even with the post-Conti shakeup. Threat actors have made very significant efforts to increase the victim's willingness to pay. And this market continues to be a very financially lucrative one for these criminal actors. So now that we've taken a look back at the year, let's go and look and see what we can expect into the next year. So at a high level, we're anticipating continued growth and evolution in the ransomware space with some changes to actors, the tools they use, and how they use them. That said, we can't forget about nation states. Expect to see more activity as geopolitics continues to be a driving force in nation state APT actor activity. So let's dive in a little bit. So with ransomware working so well up until now, this is likely going to be the continued attack vector of choice for crime syndicates or any other monetarily motivated actor. The ability to monetize downtime and extortion against victims really has propelled ransomware into a massive economy, with some estimates at nearly $40 billion in losses by 2024. With ransomware being so effective against its victims, there's really no indication that this is going to slow down anytime soon. Expect to see more interactive attacks. So this year we saw a revival of the bazaar call technique where attackers actively engage their victims over the phone before tricking them to download and execute malicious files. Attackers will continue to leverage these types of attacks and will continue to evolve in order to enable them to bypass traditional defenses. Attackers are going to continue to target the identity. So as traditional network boundaries continue to dissolve, phishing and identity-based attacks are rich targets for adversaries to gain access. And even with multi-factor authentication, organizations may still be vulnerable to attack. And so this year, we observed attacker infrastructure and capabilities dedicated to allowing adversaries to bypass or even proxy traditional token-based MFA. Attackers are also going to continue to focus on critical infrastructure and organizations who have very high incentive to pay ransoms so that they can minimize downtime. So think retail during the holiday season, agriculture during harvest time, times like that those individuals or those companies really want to move on and get back to normal operations. So while traditional ransomware continues to encrypt the data, attackers have become frustrated with network captured keys that are allowing the free recovery of data that's been ransomed by them. This year, Critical Start Research Unit reported on instances where we had observed actors and malware authors transitioning to Rust-based malware, including groups such as Black Cat and Hive. This is significant because the way that Rust-based malware is compiled, it's often more predictably stable in its execution, more efficient, and much more difficult to reverse engineer, which really increases those chances of success for those actors using these particular strains of malware. In addition to the choice in languages, the shift in that direction, we also expect to see a transition in the way that ransomware operates. And so instead of simply encrypting, we anticipate actors are going to start exfiltrating and destroying data, requiring victims to pay to actually get that data back. And so early on, ransomware is a simple act of petty crime. You lock up some files, you get some payment, you move on. As we see the market change, it becomes apparent that the more layers that adversaries put between their victims and their data, or their victims and safety, or their victims in operation, the higher likelihood of payout, and then the greater the ransom that an actor could demand. And so even holdouts such as Conti end up capitulating to this model and getting involved in the extortion game. So as we discussed earlier, groups such as Karakurt, Blackbyte, and Black Basta have emerged, focusing primarily on the exfiltration of the data. As organizations become more resilient to ransomware, the actors are going to continue to find ways to further incentivize payments, likely skipping the ransom and going straight to extortion, demanding a payment with the threat of disclosure of sensitive data. And so while ransomware did take center stage, got a lot of attention, nation states are still very much an active entity and a clear and present danger to organizations. And so nation state activity is still very active as the conflict with Ukraine continues, and as tensions continue to rise with China. And so Russia may intend to destroy and interfere where China will continue its focus on the theft of intellectual property, including targets from biomedical, manufacturing, and the technology industries, especially those that are military oriented. So China has been known to implement operatives at their targets of interest, meaning that many organizations not only facing the APT, the external threat, but also the increasing likelihood of facing insider threats. And so what? So with all of this madness, what do we take away from this year and do to better prepare ourselves? So number one, focus on posture management. Focus on the basics. Many of these attacks are exploiting configuration errors, mistakes, well-known patched vulnerabilities. Understanding your attack surface, what it looks like, with the aid of technology will help organizations understand where they can make improvements. Phishing continues to be the most effective tool, the most effective way that adversaries gain access to their victims. SMS-based phishing, also known as smishing, and social media are also targets of opportunity. Continue to educate your users on what these attacks look like, especially as attackers move away from traditional mouse spam campaigns with attachments and links, and migrate more towards callback phishing mechanisms. Individual accountability should be considered here to ensure the understanding that the actions of a single person can cost the livelihood of many. According to research provided by Malwarebytes, nearly 20% of companies impacted by ransomware will shut down. So it really does become an issue of everybody's life and livelihood, not just the actions of an individual. And so from a technical standpoint, there are ways to implement stronger forms of multi-factor or passwordless authentication. Things like number matching combined with conditional access policies to better manage risky sign-ins. And so look for signals such as sign-ins from a strange location, sign-ins at a strange time, sign-ins to new applications, and then use those to change your approach to requiring certain levels of authentication. Many attackers are now also using legitimate binaries and software, what we refer to as living off of the land, to conduct their malicious operations. And so this makes them incredibly hard to detect, as they're oftentimes lost in the noise of low or medium alerts. And so in this day and age, even these medium and low alerts can be a strong indicator of attack, often at earlier stages where eradication and recovery are often less difficult than if the actor achieves their actions on their objective. This year, Critical Start's cyber research unit investigated and deployed over 200 detections to our supported products this year. Our detections focus on detecting attacker activity, not just the capabilities or infrastructure that they use. So we're not looking for IP addresses, domains, or hashes. We're looking for those living off the land signatures that we can detect to identify potential malicious activity that we've observed being leveraged by threat actors. And then combined with our trusted behavior registry, this becomes a powerful weapon to detect attackers who are attempting to fly under the radar. So a final note, risk-based security. Leveraging frameworks such as the NIST cybersecurity framework really does help to provide some guidance around your cybersecurity initiatives. And so instead of playing security whack-a-mole, these frameworks allow organizations to structure their roadmap without waiting for a successful attack to identify the next security project. And so a big hats off to organizations who are leaning on these risk-based security approaches to really drive continued maturity in their programs. And with that, I wanted to thank everybody for their time. If there's any questions, I'm happy to leave the floor open.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew. And we do have time for some questions, everyone. If you have them, please send them in the chat or over the Q&A. We did get one in the Q&A while you were talking about kind of the new tools that are coming in next year. And this person asked, would these solutions scan and save data before any attack would take place just to offer better recovery? I don't know if you can answer that one.
And so there are tools out there that help to restore data. There are some providers that do that. From a backup standpoint, the best option is using air-gapped backups. And so making sure that those backups are completely separated from your Active Directory infrastructure. Typically, attackers are going to target the domain, they're going to target credentials, identity, and access. And if they gain access to that and individuals' backups are connected to that, it's game over. And so make sure you have complete separation there so that you can restore. Whether or not providers provide additional backup solutions, it really depends on how those actors will actually be able to access those consoles, whether they're cloud-based, whether they're on-premise, whether they're connected to identity or not. So lots of considerations there.
Awesome. Another question we got is there a Geneva Convention style cyber code of conduct for nation states to sign onto and agree to?
This is a really good question. Right now, there is no standing guidance that I'm aware of on how nation states operate in cyberspace. And so earlier in the current administration, the president did provide some guidance on our response to attacks on critical infrastructure. However, there are no enforcement mechanisms. And because attribution in cyberspace is so difficult because adversaries will use infrastructure that cannot necessarily be directly tied back to them, it becomes a very difficult proposition to tie an attack to a specific attacker in real time.
Awesome. Excellent. Any last questions for Matthew? Those are the two that we got in. Give it a little bit, see if people are typing those out. All righty. I don't see anything, so we can close out here a little bit early. So thank you all so much for attending our final Lunch and Learn of 2022. Hope you guys found that valuable, and just a big round of applause for Matthew, our fantastic speaker. Be on a lookout for an email from Uber Eats this afternoon with your $25 voucher. That is, again, good through next Thursday, December 22nd. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or our team. We can get those answered for you. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week. Have a happy and safe holiday season, and we'll see you in 2023.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.